Today, what we are going to do as the second part of this DevOps chapter, we are going to deploy AWS resources with Azure DevOps. So previously, you have seen that we have deployed Azure resources with Azure DevOps pipeline. Today, we will utilize the same functionality with Azure DevOps pipeline and deploy AWS resources. Our code will still be there in our GitHub repository. We will not import the code base into Azure DevOps. Rather, it will stay in GitHub repository. We will commit directly in the GitHub, and this will create a hook. One service connection will come into picture, and then the pipeline will trigger, and we will deploy resources. How that will work out, everything we will do from scratch. So what we will do today? So we will do AWS resources, and we will use Terraform with Azure DevOps. So you know this picture, right? This architecture diagram that with Azure, we have seen in Azure resources, we have deployed one virtual network with the help of Terraform and Azure DevOps. Today, we will not deploy the virtual network. Rather, we will deploy an S3 bucket in AWS account with Terraform and Azure DevOps pipeline. It's very interesting. The project overview. What is the project overview? You also know the project overview from Azure perspective. That in Azure we have imported the code into Azure DevOps and then pipeline triggered and deployed resources in Azure. But today in AWS we will not import the uh, code base into the Azure DevOps. Rather, the code base will still stay in the GitHub repository, and from the GitHub repository, the pipeline will trigger and the pipeline will deploy AWS resources. Now, what is the architecture diagram? I have already discussed this architecture diagram with you multiple times. Now, let us see the architecture diagram again. So we have our pipeline in GitHub repository, which will be triggered whenever we will make a commit to the GitHub repository, and that commit will trigger our pipeline. Then the pipeline will go to our identity and access management of AWS, and it will ask for a token. Then identity and access management of AWS will consider or will check for the trust relationship of Azure DevOps, and it will generate a token. And that particular token will be given to our pipeline by identity and access management of AWS, and then pipeline will have the token, and then it will deploy resources to AWS. How it will do, what needs to be done, what are the resources needs to be created for this part to work on, we will do everything from scratch. So stay on. Now, again, I will not put so much thing, or I will not invest so much time in this PowerPoint presentation. Rather we will do practical. So let's implement something from scratch. So what we will do here, we will trigger our pipeline first. To if we don't trigger the pipeline, then it will not be deployed. So from GitHub, we have to trigger our pipeline, and how to do that? So first of all, we have to create a OIDC trust in AWS. How this works? So you have to create a role. We will create a OIDC provider in AWS. If you know about this, how it works, OIDC. I have a video of OIDC provider, how it works. Please go and take a look. So now we will create a OIDC provider in AWS and associate the OIDC provider to a role that our pipeline will assume to deploy resources. And when the OIDC trust is created, we will then go back to our Azure and install the extensions of AWS to work properly, to create the service connection. And on the next set, what we will do, we will create the service connection. So as soon as our OIDC connector is there, as soon as we create the OIDC connection in AWS, we will create the service connection in Azure to assume that particular OIDC connector. Then our pipeline will go to the OIDC connector, and it will say that, okay, I have to go to AWS for the identity and access management service, and then it will give me a temporary token or JWT token so that I can deploy resources to AWS, and then but that particular token will be given back to our pipeline to deploy resources to AWS. And whenever the service connection is done, then we will create the pipeline so that our pipeline is triggered from our GitHub repository and it can deploy resources. Okay. So let's go back to the portals of AWS and Azure and check how can we deploy resources from Azure DevOps to AWS. First of all, we will create one S3 bucket, but this is a generic pipeline, right? So we are only creating an S3 bucket right now with this pipeline, but you can create whatever you want with this pipeline. You can create a whole lot of project in AWS with this pipeline. The only thing that I will show you here is how to do the DevOps part, how to create the pipeline in Azure DevOps to deploy resources in AWS. You can deploy whatever resource you want in AWS with this pipeline. You can create whatever resources in Terraform. We will use Terraform. I will give you the code base. So utilizing this particular code base, utilizing this particular pipeline, you can deploy resources to AWS. So let's get our hand dirty now. I have one last slide, which only makes sense when we do the whole project, when we deploy something in AWS directly. So I will show you the last slide and how it works and everything after our project is done. So let's get to the portal and see how that works. Now I'm back with my AWS Azure DevOps portal, and in the DevOps portal, you see, if you know Azure DevOps portal, you know that there is an organization, and within that organization, you can create project. Now, my organization and the project name is same, but you can give the project name as whatever you want. I have already opened my Azure DevOps part, also the GitHub code repository where my code is there. I will give access to this code repository to everyone so that you can take a look, and the AWS account where we will be deploying resources. We will only deploy S3 bucket now. As of now, in US East region, you can use whatever region you want, but we will only use um, uh, US East 1 region as of now. So we will deploy S3 bucket in US East 1 region. Now, going back to the Azure DevOps portal, very important part is if you have not created an Azure DevOps project right now, if you want to create it, please go ahead and create it. And after you create the project, you have to give the job to run your job. You have to give the form. You have to submit one form to Microsoft. So what that it means, if we go to organization settings, under organization settings, if you go to this agent pools under pipelines, or maybe the settings, or under pipeline settings, sorry, under parallel jobs, if you go to parallel jobs, you see here currently my parallel jobs consumption is only 5 under 1800 minutes. So, and also I have one self hosted parallel jobs which is given to me. So one parallel jobs up to 1800 minutes per month is granted to me. Whenever you create the first DevOps project or in your DevOps organization, you might not get it. So you have to request Microsoft to get this free tier permission, and you have to wait for 2 or 3 days maybe to get it approved. For me, it was very quick. It was only one day. I just waited, and then it is approved. So I saw this self-hosted parallel jobs is approved for me. But if you don't have it, please go and request that with Microsoft, and it's very easy. There is an online form available. I can give the form link in the description box so that you can request it from Microsoft with your organization ID from Azure DevOps. But it's very easy. Now, if you remember the slide, the first thing that we have to do, we have to create an YDC trust in AWS. What does it mean? So we have to go to AWS where our resources will deploy, and we have to go to IAM. And under the IAM service, we have to go to identity providers. So right now I'm in my IAM portal of AWS, and I go on the left hand side to identity providers. Right now I don't have anything, so I will add an identity provider. The identity provider type will be OpenID Connect. So whenever you select OpenID Connect, you have to put two part of this, or two information to AWS. about one is the provider URL and one is the audience. So the my provider URL will be specific to my Azure DevOps organization, and my audience is also specific to my DevOps organization. So I have two information that I have already copied, and I will copy it over here in this blank space, and then I will resume. So the provider URL and the audience is this. So this provider URL is this one, vstoken.dev.azure.com, and then your org ID, and your audience is API, then Azure AD Token Exchange. Now, the question is, how do you get this org ID? This is very unique to your organization. So if you go to your DevOps organization, and then here under the organization, under the organization settings, if you go to Microsoft Entra, and I have connected my Azure Microsoft Entra here with this DevOps part, so that's why the default directory is my tenant ID. This is my tenant ID, but if you didn't connect it, you will not be able to see it. There is a very this is a very common way, or this is very easy process to connect your Azure Active Directory or the Entra directly here. There will be a button where you can just authenticate your Entra Azure portal here with this DevOps, and it will be populated. And also there is a button called Download Azure DevOps Organization connected to default directory. So if you download this, there will be one Excel sheet which I will save it now and I will show you. Yes, I want to replace it. I have already done that, but to show you what it is, this is your org ID. So this is your organization ID. It will show the organization name is Amit Nag. This is my name. I have given my organization name as list. This is the URL of your organization, and this is the owner. So, but what we exactly need is the organization ID, and this is the way you can get your organization ID, and you can put it into the OIDC provider URL. There is another way of doing it where you don't have to, you can give it whatever you want, and then you run the pipeline, and in pipeline you will get some error. And on that particular error, the provider URL is also given. But just to feel safe, this is a better way to download your org ID and to keep it somewhere safe, to know that this is your organization ID. Okay, so whenever we have this provider URL and audience, what we can do, we can add the provider. Whenever we will add the provider, it will ask me that your provider is added, but you need to assign a role to the provider so that to work on. And to work on, in our case, that means our pipeline can assume the role. So I will assign a role to it, and I will create a new role. I will click next. The web identity is already selected. Identity provider it already took. The one that I have created, audience, I will select from the drop down box as Azure AD Token Exchange, and I will click next. I will give this role as permission of administrative access as of now for demo purpose, but for in production, you don't give administrative access. Always use the least privilege access for your role. So that right now I'm using, I will just create one S3 bucket, right? So you can just only give the role that create S3 bucket permission, and that will be all. But for this demo purpose, as I will delete everything after this demo, I will give the administrative access, and this is fine. And I will click on next, and I will give the role a name like AWS OIDC connection. Why I have given this name like this, I will explain it a bit later, and I will not change anything else. Now, the trust policy, you see it's automatically generated. The federated is the identity provider that we have created. So our identity provider is actually authenticated or authorized to assume role of this assume role with this role and do something which it is authorized to do, that in our case it is kind of administrative access that we have given. So from the roles and the trust perspective, it is fine. So we will just create the role, and the role is created. We will see the role, and we see the role is created, and we just need the ARN of this role to create the service connection. Anyway, so we go back again the trust connection, and we see the trust relationship is currently okay. You can, of course, give the condition a more stringent way so that only your Azure DevOps organization can assume this role. In that case, you have to give the audience also as your Azure DevOps organization ID. In that case, this particular role can only be assumed by your organization and only be assumed by your organizational project. That also you can do. But for the demo purpose, this is fine. You can leave it as it is if you are following me through. Now, okay. Now the thing is, the next part is install the extension. What does it mean? So we have created the OIDC trust in AWS. Now we go back to our Azure portal, and we have to now install a couple of extensions. So the extensions are based on the org level. So if you go back to your Azure DevOps organization under organization settings, we go here under extensions and couple of extensions. Only one extension we need. Why? Let me show you why. So if we go back again to the organization and under project, if we open the project and under project settings, here in the service connection, we have to create one service connection, right? So why? Because our Azure DevOps don't know where to connect to deploy the resources when the pipeline will run. The definition is given in the pipeline itself, the pipeline command itself, but it doesn't know where to go. To let him know, so we have to create one service connection for that. That Azure, please go to AWS and this is your service connection. So from our pipeline, Azure will know that we have to connect to AWS, but where is the service connection? Where should we go? What should we use? So for that, we need to create a service connection. And right now, if you click on the create service connection, you will not be able to see AWS because it is not by default installed in Azure DevOps. So for that, what we have to do, we go to organization and under organization settings, we go extensions and we browse marketplace and then we search for AWS and then we got this AWS toolkit for Azure DevOps. We will get it for free. We will install it for free. And this is the toolkit that is needed for Azure DevOps to deploy resources into AWS. And I will install the toolkit. It will take a couple of seconds and this is done. So I go back to my organization. I go back to the organization settings and I see under extensions, my AWS toolkit for Azure DevOps is created. All right. Now we go back to our organization and our project. This time, this is under project. And under project, what we have to do, create the service connection. So we have created the, so we have installed the extension. Now under project settings, so a couple of things. So we have to first create the service connection for AWS and also we have to create the GitHub connections. So if you come to the GitHub connections right now, as I said, my code is in GitHub repository. We will not import the code directly into Azure DevOps. So if we create a GitHub connections for that in that way, we do not have to import the code into Azure DevOps. Rather, if we commit something in our GitHub directly, it will automatically trigger the pipeline in Azure DevOps. So for that, we need to connect our GitHub account. So I will just click connecting our GitHub account. As I have already signed in couple of times, that's why it didn't ask me about my authentication. But if you have not signed in with any of your GitHub account, it will ask you to sign in with which GitHub account you want to use, and you just put in your credentials. That's it, and it will get all your repository under that GitHub. And right now, I will choose the one which is Azure DevOps deploy AWS resources, this one, and I will save it. And then whenever you are done, we see that our GitHub application is now connected. GitHub connection is done. All right. Now we go back to the service connection and I will create the service connection. And right now I see my AWS is populated here and I will select next. Now, as we are deploying the pipeline, as we are deploying the resources with OIDC connection, not using any kind of a access key or secret key, so this is optional. I will not put anything here. Session token, I will not put anything. Now the role is to assume. As I said, if you remember, I need only the ARN, so I have copied the ARN and I will paste it. So this role, they need to assume, our Azure DevOps pipeline need to assume to deploy resources in AWS. Role session name, I will not give anything, and if you don't give anything, it will auto generate the role session name. And the external ID is also optional, and I will ask Azure DevOps that use OIDC. And whenever I will ask use OIDC, it will check for the role, and under the role it will find the trust relationship with the OIDC provider and it will deploy resources. The service connection name is something I will give AWS OIDC connection. It is the same as the role. I didn't look into it, but it's okay. You just give the service connection name the same thing, and I will grant the service connection to all our pipeline. This permission to use the service connection to all our pipeline, and I will save it. As soon as I save it, my AWS OIDC connection service connection is there. Now I'm ready to deploy resources in AWS. What we can do now, we go back to our project. We go back to our project, and under pipeline we have to create the pipeline. So we select create pipeline. As I said, our pipeline is currently under the GitHub repository, so we will select GitHub. And whenever we select the GitHub, you remember our repository is already connected, so it will bring up all my repositories, so saying like for which repository you want to create the pipeline. And I will select Azure DevOps deploy AWS resources, so this one I will select, and then it will bring me my pipeline YAML. Now you see that here we have this AWS connection name, and it is AWS OIDC connection. And if you remember a couple of minutes back, I have created the same connection name, AWS OIDC connection. If you have not done the same connection name, please change the connection name here, and this will work out. Now I will not change anything else, and I will click on run. Let's see. So whenever I will click on run, so this pipeline will go to that particular AWS connection name, and it will take the connection. It will get the trust relationship from AWS, and it will try to deploy the resources. So let's see how it works. If we go back to our deploy S3 bucket, I think it will give me a problem, or it will not work out the way that I think, and I will tell you why. I think it will fail at the first run. So let's see. I have to wait for a couple of seconds. Let's see, the setup of AWS credentials is running right now. Mm, This will be fast. This is done. Now it will do Terraform init. So the Terraform init failed. Let's see why. So the Terraform init failed because you see, it is asking me to give a bucket name to hold the state. And right now there is no bucket name BTC Terraform state and this one. So if you go to the here in my AWS portal, right now I have not created any bucket to hold the state. So let's create the state. So I will give this one, I will copy it, and I will create the bucket. I will change the bucket name to maybe a different number. Yeah, so this is fine. So this is my state bucket. So let's see, I will create the bucket, and right now the bucket is created. So whenever the bucket is created, I go back to my GitHub repository. Remember, if I commit it from here, it will trigger the pipeline. So I go back to the provider section, and then I will edit the file, and here is my backend bucket. I will change it. I will change the backend bucket, and I will commit the changes. It's still thinking, and I will commit. So I have committed the changes in the main branch. It should trigger the pipeline. Let's go back to our pipeline. and it triggered the pipeline. So this is the second run. Yeah, this is the second run. So update the S3 bucket name. And if we see now, let's see if everything works out well. Or I don't know, I have already uh, deployed the bucket couple of times, so maybe it will complain me about the bucket name itself. But let's see. Also, I have deleted the bucket, so it should not complain. But AWS takes some time to delete the whole bucket and its infrastructure. If you have already, uh, if you have already deployed the bucket with the same name in somewhere, but I don't know. Let's see. So Terraform init currently done. So initialization of backend is done. Terraform plan is also done. So the bucket name is BTC Terraform my bucket or something. And now Terraform apply is also done. Okay, so let's see. We have deployed our bucket. Let's see. So we have two buckets. One is our state bucket and another one is the bucket that we wanted to deploy. So we come back here. This is our code base and this is our main.tf and this is our bucket. So we are currently only deploying one bucket, one S3 bucket, and the bucket name is coming from the variable, and the variable is this one, PTC Terraform my bucket 7624 or something, 7624, and this is my bucket. So our pipeline ran, and if you go to pipeline here, you see the first one failed due to the state bucket was not there, but the second one deployed our resources. Awesome. So our AWS resources is now deployed with Azure DevOps pipeline. What we can do here, we can also rename the pipeline. I don't like the name of the pipeline. So deploy AWS resource. Maybe this name is correct. This name makes more sense. So our pipeline name is deploy AWS resource. So you have seen that how can we leverage our Azure DevOps pipeline to deploy resources in AWS, creating a service connection with the OIDC provider URL. I personally really like Azure DevOps because I have used AWS code pipeline as well, and GitHub. I also like GitHub Actions. It is faster. AWS code pipeline is also okay. It is a bit slower. Now, whenever I tried this Azure DevOps pipeline, it is much more faster and it deploys in very fast way your resources to AWS. In AWS code pipeline, it will build a project, it will create a project, install every resources, and it will take some time. The time that it is mentioned here, kind of, let's see how much time it took. It's only took 36 seconds. For AWS, I have not seen one pipeline which is running under 36 seconds or 50 seconds or something. I have to always wait for 1 minute or so to deploy resources. I'm not complaining, but all this is only my personal opinion. But if you think that AWS is faster, it's always go with AWS. I'm not imposing anything. This is only my personal observation. I find it GitHub Reactions and Azure DevOps is much faster than AWS code pipeline. Now, if you remember, I only said that I have one last slide which I wanted to come back after the whole project is finished, right? Because this only makes sense when you see the whole thing works. So let's go back to that particular slide and I will show you that how those things works, how the authentication works, how the deployment of resources works. Now it makes more sense and you can relate more to that particular project when you have done the hands-on before doing the hands-on. So let's go back to that PPT and let's see what was there. So this is my last PPT and this is the architecture diagram of the resource deployment of AWS with Azure DevOps and how the authentication and authorization actually works under the hood. So first of all, we have this Azure Active Directory, and Azure Active Directory is under this Azure Active Directory, you have your org ID. Under the org ID, you are running your pipeline. This is my Azure DevOps pipeline. And whenever we trigger the pipeline, it requests a token to whom? From your Azure DevOps OIDC issuer URL. So your DevOps pipeline needs a OIDC issuer URL from your Azure Entra. And then Entra gives back a temporary token to your DevOps so that the DevOps can authorize itself that I am an authorized person to request a token from whom. This is the very important part. It sends the token to AWS STS with assume role web identity. So then AWS STS service checks for the token. Yeah, this is the token valid, and it gives the DevOps the assume role web identity credentials. By how? By selecting, by checking the trust relationship in the AWS IAM portal. If you remember the trust relationship, it was with assume role web identity. So this is where the term coming in. So whenever AWS STS goes to the AWS identity provider, and it says that okay, I there is an identity provider which actually trusted by Azure DevOps organization that we have set up, and then it checks and it says that okay, we have a trustee which asks for a token to deploy AWS resources, and then the AWS checks for the provider URL and the trust relationship of the DevOps pipeline, and it says okay, I can generate a token and I can generate a temporary credentials to you so that you can deploy resources with checking the role and everything, checking the role and the trust relationship of the OIDC provider. Then Azure AWS IAM actually generate the token and pass back the token to our pipeline. And then our pipeline, Azure pipeline, will have the temporary credentials to deploy resources to our AWS environment. So under the hood, this is how it works. So our pipeline goes to DevOps OIDC issuer URL. Issuer URL generates a temporary token. This token taken by STS provider of AWS. STS will go to IAM, and IAM will check for the trust relationship. The trust relationship is done, and then it will give a temporary token to our pipeline, and then our pipeline taking the temporary token, deploying the resources to AWS. This is the whole architecture of underlying architecture of how a pipeline works, how Azure works, and how Azure authenticates itself and authorized itself to deploy resources to AWS. This is a very interesting, very interesting fact how it works, and I hope I was a bit helpful to you guys to understand how this works under the hood. But let me know in the comment section if you really like this video, so that or if you need some changes to this particular video, and we can make something out of it. Now, this is what I wanted to show you. This is a 3 series video. You know how to deploy resources with Azure DevOps to Azure and to AWS as well. I hope you really like this video, and I hope you really enjoyed this series. So if you have any idea or any suggestion on how to improve my videos, or what to do in as a new content for my video, please let me know in the comment section. I'm always happy to help. Apart from that, I will be back with another exciting video. Till then, take care and goodbye.